the quiet, picturesque town of Amstetten, Austria, a monstrous secret was festering. For 24 years, it hid in plain sight, buried under a neat family home on a tidy street. It took a dying girl to finally bring it to the surface. For nearly a quarter century, a man who seemed like an ordinary husband, father, and community member was harboring a horror that is almost impossible to comprehend. In a custom-built dungeon beneath his house, he held his own daughter captive, subjecting her to unimaginable abuse and fathering 7 children with her. This is the story of Josef Fritzl. It's a story that forces us to stare into the abyss and explore the twisted mind of a man who built a prison fueled by his own dark and abusive past. A story of unimaginable horror, hidden just beneath the surface of a seemingly normal life. To the outside world, the house at Ibstrasse 40 was nothing special. It was a gray, multi-story apartment building, owned and managed by its longtime resident, Josef Fritzl. Born in 1935, Josef was a retired electrical engineer, a man people in Amstetten would have described as stern, maybe a bit eccentric, but ultimately unremarkable. He was a landlord, a husband to Rosemarie, and a father to their 7 children. He had a commanding presence and ran his household with an iron fist, but this was often dismissed as just old-fashioned patriarchal control. Upstairs, life seemed to follow a familiar rhythm. Rosemarie Fritzl managed the home, raised their children, and later raised 3 children she believed had been abandoned by her runaway daughter. The family took vacations. They had gatherings. Josef was known to be a diligent worker who spent countless hours in the basement, a space he declared completely off-limits to everyone, including his wife. He'd say his constant tinkering was for work, for designs and technical plans. No one questioned him. Any noises from below were just Josef at his workbench. This was the carefully built facade, a life of mundane routine and quiet respectability in a town where people knew their neighbors, yet no one really saw a thing. Josef Fritzl presented himself as an ordinary man, the head of his house. He was shielded by the privacy that society affords every family, and by the comforting assumption that the horrors we read about happened somewhere else, to someone else. But the truth of Ibstrasse 40 was a chilling split reality. While one family lived in the light upstairs, another was imprisoned in the total darkness below. The master of both worlds was the same man, moving between them with ease, locking one reality away before walking up the stairs to the other. The question that would eventually haunt the world wasn't just what he did, but how. How did this man manage to keep such a horrific secret for so long, right under everyone's noses? To understand that, we have to go back, long before the cellar was built, to the childhood that forged the monster. Josef Fritzl's depravity didn't come from nowhere. It grew in the toxic soil of his own childhood. Born in 1935, his early life was shaped by an absent father who abandoned the family when he was 4, and a domineering, abusive mother who stayed. He described himself as an alibi child, born only to prove his mother wasn't barren. He felt he wasn't a child to be loved, but a symbol to erase a woman's shame. His mother, by his account, was a cruel and unpredictable force. He claimed he was subjected to severe physical and emotional abuse, with beatings so brutal they would leave him bleeding on the floor. He grew up feeling constantly humiliated, weak, and starved of affection. In his own home, he was powerless. This relentless abuse planted a seed of deep resentment and a desperate, pathological need for control, a need that would later grow into an all-consuming obsession. As he got older, that inner darkness began to surface. Long before he imprisoned his daughter, There were terrifying warning signs. In 1967, Fritzl was arrested and served a prison sentence for breaking into a nurse's home and raping her at knife point. He was also a suspect in another attempted rape and was known for indecent exposure. But under Austrian law at the time, his criminal record was wiped clean after 15 years, allowing him to blend back into society as a predator in plain sight. Years later, forensic psychiatrist Dr. Heidi Kastner, who evaluated him extensively, diagnosed him with a severe combined personality disorder, including borderline, schizotypal, and schizoid traits. This meant he likely struggled with unstable relationships, had a distorted view of reality, and was profoundly detached from others' feelings. He was described as emotionally illiterate, incapable of genuine empathy. At the core of his motivation was a deep, unresolved fixation on his mother. He held a toxic mix of love and searing hatred for the woman who had tormented him. In a chilling preview of what was to come, Fritzl claimed that as his mother grew old and frail, he imprisoned her in an attic room of the house, bricking up her window and leaving her there until her death in 1980. He was now the one in control. He was the jailer. Unable to direct his rage and deviant urges at their original source, he redirected them onto a new target, his own daughter, Elisabeth. She became the stand-in for his mother, an object on which he could enact his depraved fantasies of power, control, and revenge. In his twisted mind, the abuse he would inflict on her was a conversation with the ghost of his past. He once chillingly stated, "I was born to rape, and I held myself back for a relatively long time." This reveals a man who saw his evil not as a choice, but as a destiny he was simply fulfilling. By 1984, Elisabeth Fritzl was 18 and on the verge of starting her own life. She had just finished a course to become a waitress and had a job lined up. She was ready to escape the oppressive atmosphere of her family home and the control of her father, who had already been sexually abusing her since she was 11. But Josef Fritzl wasn't about to let her go. He had spent years meticulously preparing for this moment. On August 28, 1984, he put his monstrous plan into action. He lured Elisabeth into the basement, a place she and the rest of the family were forbidden from entering. He told her he needed help carrying a heavy door. Trusting him, she followed. As she held the door in place, he pressed a towel soaked in ether to her face. As she passed out, he dragged her into the soundproofed chamber he had built just for her. That door was the final seal on her prison, and the last time she would see the outside world for 24 years. With Elisabeth his captive, Fritzl began the cover-up. He forced her to write a letter, postmarked from a distant town, telling her parents she had run away to join a religious cult and begged them not to look for her. When Rosemarie found her daughter missing, she was distraught and filed a report. But the letter provided Josef with the perfect twisted explanation. He showed it to the police, and the investigation stalled. Friends and neighbors whispered, but ultimately accepted the story. How could they imagine the truth was so much more horrifying? Over the years, Fritzl perfected this manipulation, forcing Elisabeth to write more letters to maintain the fiction that she was out in the world, living with her cult. This lie became the accepted reality for everyone upstairs. Rosemarie, her other children, and the community of Amstetten believed Elisabeth had run away. They mourned her as a lost child, never suspecting she was just a few feet beneath them, suffering in silence. Josef Fritzl's greatest accomplice was the simple fact that no one, not his wife, not his neighbors, not the police, could ever imagine a father being capable of such a thing. The space where Elisabeth Fritzl was held for 8,642 days was a purpose-built dungeon. As an engineer, Josef Fritzl had the skill to create a prison that was both inescapable and completely hidden. The entrance was concealed behind a shelf in his workshop, secured by a series of steel doors. The final door was a 1-ton, steel-reinforced concrete slab operated by a remote-controlled electronic keypad. No one could get in without the code, and no sound could get out. The cellar itself was a cramped, suffocating space of windowless rooms, totaling less than 600 square feet. The ceiling was so low in places, less than 6 feet high, that its inhabitants had to stoop. The air was thick and stale, with poor ventilation. A rudimentary toilet, shower, and a small cooking area were all she had. This was Elisabeth's entire world. For the first few years, she was alone with him. Fritzl would visit her every few days, bringing food and supplies. His visits were her only source of survival, but also the source of her unending terror. He controlled the light, the food, the very air she breathed. And with this absolute control came relentless sexual abuse. The horror escalated when Elisabeth began having children. In the damp, unsterile confines of the cellar, she gave birth to 7 children, all alone. Her first child, Kirsten, was born in 1988, followed by Stefan, Lisa, Monica, Alexander, and Felix. A 7th child, a boy named Michael, was born as a twin to Alexander in 1996 but had breathing problems. Fritzl refused to get medical help, and the baby died in his mother's arms after 3 days. Fritzl later admitted to burning the infant's body in the furnace. This is where Fritzl's double life became even more diabolical. He decided some of the children would live upstairs with him and Rosemarie. In 1993, he showed up on his own doorstep with 9-month-old Lisa, claiming he'd found her in a cardboard box with a note from Elisabeth. Incredibly, the story worked. He repeated this grotesque theater twice more, bringing Monica and Alexander upstairs in a similar fashion. So the family existed in 2 parts, separated by a concrete floor. Upstairs, Rosemarie was a grandmother, raising 3 children she believed her wayward daughter had abandoned. She loved them and took them to school, all while their real mother and their other siblings, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, were imprisoned directly beneath her feet. The upstairs children grew up with sunlight and school, while their downstairs siblings knew only artificial light and the stories their mother told them of a world they'd never seen. Their only real connection to that world was a small television. How could a wife not know? How could a man bring 3 foundling children into his home without raising alarms? Fritzl ruled through fear and manipulation. He had forbidden Rosemarie from ever entering the basement. He explained the children as the burden they had to bear for their daughter's choices. To the world, he was a long-suffering grandfather, cleaning up his daughter's messes. The sheer audacity of his lies, combined with his authoritarian control, created a bubble of ignorance around him. The details of this case are incredibly disturbing. If you find this analysis valuable for understanding the complexities of such a crime and want to support more in-depth content, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It makes a huge difference and allows us to continue exploring these important, though often difficult, stories. Now back to how Fritzl maintained this monstrous reality. To Josef Fritzl, the cellar was more than a prison. He called it his kingdom. In this underground world, he was not the humiliated boy from his childhood. He was a god. Every element was under his absolute control, a complete reversal of the powerlessness he felt under his mother's reign. The cellar was a stage where he could endlessly reenact his own trauma. He was no longer the victim. He was the master. The acts of violence and sexual domination gave him an addictive feeling of ultimate power. Through the repeated abuse of Elisabeth, he was, in a twisted way, continuing a relationship with his mother, but one where he now had total dominance. He was finally getting revenge on the woman who made him feel so small, using his daughter as a substitute. His psychopathic traits were on full display. His grandiosity was clear in his belief that he could maintain this monstrous secret forever. His manipulative genius showed in how he fooled his wife, the police, and social workers with the outlandish story of the foundling children. He played the part of the burdened patriarch so convincingly that the system designed to protect children failed completely. But he wasn't psychotic or out of touch with reality. Dr. Heidi Kastner, the psychiatrist who evaluated him, stated that Fritzl was perfectly aware that his actions were wrong. He just had an unnerving ability to compartmentalize. He could inflict unimaginable horrors in the basement, then walk upstairs, have dinner with his family, and watch television as if nothing was wrong. Dr. Kastner described him as a man driven by an insatiable need for sexualized power and control. He rationalized his crimes by telling himself that stopping was no longer an option. He knew that if he ever let Elisabeth go, she would be too broken to reintegrate into society without revealing the truth. And for him, exposure, the loss of control, and the public shame was a fate worse than continuing his reign of terror. So he carried on for 24 years. For 24 years, Fritzl's perfect, monstrous system worked. But in April 2008, it all started to unravel because of something he couldn't control: a medical emergency. Kirsten, the eldest cellar daughter, then 19, fell gravely ill. She was losing consciousness, and her life was in danger. Fritzl was now trapped. For the first time, he faced a problem he couldn't solve with force or lies. If he did nothing and Kirsten died, he'd have to dispose of a 19-year-old's body, far riskier than an infant's. Worse, Elisabeth, watching her daughter die, might become completely uncontrollable. But if he got help, he risked exposing everything. After days of agonizing, Fritzl made a fateful choice. He chose the hospital. He carried Kirsten's unconscious body out of the cellar, the first time she had ever been outside, and drove her to a local hospital. He left her there and called with a fabricated story, claiming he'd found Kirsten on his doorstep with a note from Elisabeth asking for help. But this time, the story didn't stick. Hospital staff were immediately suspicious. Here was a critically ill young woman, pale and malnourished, with no medical records and a bizarre collection of symptoms. Doctors knew they needed to speak to the mother to get a family medical history that could save Kirsten's life. So the doctors and police went public. They issued a televised appeal for the missing mother, Elisabeth Fritzl, to come forward and help her daughter. Fritzl saw it. He knew his time was running out. The walls were closing in. He wavered for several days, but the police were now heavily involved, their questions growing more pointed. Finally, on April 26, 2008, Fritzl made his last move. He went down to the cellar and told Elisabeth and her two sons, Stefan and Felix, that they were all going to be released because Kirsten was sick. He brought them out into the light and drove them to the hospital, planning to stick to his story that Elisabeth had finally come home from her cult. But it was too late. The moment police separated Elisabeth from her father, the illusion he had maintained for nearly a quarter of a century was doomed. At the police station, Elisabeth was finally safe, but she was silent. She had lived under her father's absolute control for her entire adult life, and the psychological chains weren't easily broken. She made one demand. She would tell her story only if the police guaranteed she would never have to see her father again. Once that promise was made, the floodgates opened. For hours, Elisabeth recounted the nightmare of the last 24 years. The imprisonment, the rapes, the births, the death of baby Michael, and the double life her father led. The police listening were in shock, struggling to comprehend the scale of the depravity. Based on her testimony, Josef Fritzl was arrested that same day. When police went to Ibstrasse 40, they couldn't find the cellar entrance. Only when Fritzl, in custody, gave them the code could they open the hidden door and reveal the horror within. The trial of Josef Fritzl began in March 2009. He was charged with murder by negligence for the death of baby Michael, enslavement, thousands of counts of rape, incest, coercion, and false imprisonment. He initially pleaded guilty to most charges, but denied murder and enslavement. The turning point came when the court played an 11-hour video of Elisabeth's testimony. To protect her from facing him, her evidence was shown on screen. But Elisabeth decided to attend the trial in person, watching from the gallery. According to reports, there was a moment their eyes met. Seeing his daughter there, a survivor, finally broke him. The next day, Josef Fritzl stood before the court and admitted guilt on all charges. The verdict was swift. Josef Fritzl was sentenced to life in prison, to be served in a secure psychiatric facility for the criminally insane. The man who had built a kingdom to exercise absolute power would now spend the rest of his life stripped of all control, a prisoner himself. Following the trial, Elisabeth and her 6 surviving children were given new identities and moved to a secret, secluded location in the Austrian countryside. Their home is a fortress of privacy, protected by a community determined to let them heal. The recovery has been monumental. The children from the cellar, who had never seen sunlight, had to learn about the world from scratch. The upstairs children had to grapple with the shocking truth about their family. The entire family continues to be supported by a team of therapists. Remarkably, reports over the years have painted a picture of incredible resilience. Elisabeth reportedly found a new life and relationship. The children, now adults, have integrated into society, finding jobs and forming their own relationships. The doors in their home are said to be always left open, a powerful symbol of their freedom. Elisabeth also reconnected with her mother, Rosemarie, who was officially cleared of any knowledge of the crimes and now visits her daughter and grandchildren. As for Josef Fritzl, now nearly 90 and suffering from dementia, his story continues to evolve in the Austrian legal system. In recent years, his lawyers have argued he is no longer a danger. There have been ongoing legal battles about moving him from a secure unit to a regular prison, a potential step toward release. While courts have approved the transfer, higher courts have overturned it, and as of late 2025, his legal fate is still subject to appeals and further evaluations. His lawyer has stated he deludedly believes he would be welcomed back to his old town with a big celebration with people cheering. The case of Josef Fritzl is a story about the darkest capabilities of the human psyche. It's a story of trauma that wasn't healed, but instead twisted and passed down through an act of unimaginable cruelty. For 24 years, a man fueled by a past of abuse and a pathological need for control created a living hell just beneath the feet of his family and neighbors. He was not a madman, but a master manipulator who knew exactly what he was doing. Perhaps the most disturbing part of this case isn't just the monster himself, but the chilling fact that he hid in plain sight. It's a terrifying reminder of the secrets that can fester behind closed doors and the normal-looking facades that can conceal an abyss. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about evil, the resilience of the human spirit, and our collective responsibility to see what is right in front of us. The silence from the basement on Ibstrasse 40 wasn't just because of soundproofing. It was enabled by a world that could never imagine such a thing was possible. This story is a difficult one to process, and it leaves us with many questions. I'd like to know what has impacted you the most. Please share your reflections respectfully in the comments below. And for more deep dives that explore the psychology behind these complex cases, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Thank you for watching.